Welcome back. Didn't have a video last week, but this week I have a little bit of a math question to look at from the lesson that I posted, which is about tariffs. The lesson that you see in there talks about Canadian imports and our top 5 imports. Whenever an import comes into a country, if that country has a tariff on that import, the importing company pays a certain percentage or a certain fee to move that product across the border. There's lots of reasons for this that you can look at in the lesson and some of the lessons we've done earlier. But countries usually impose tariffs for the sole purpose of helping build domestic companies, to help companies that exist in that country compete against more expensive goods coming from overseas. It should help your home companies do better competing against foreign companies trying to send their products across the border. Of course, that's always the intention, but tariffs don't always necessarily work out that way when they are imposed. Let's look at some actual tariff data. The US a few years ago imposed a 25% tariff on steel from Canada going over the Canada US border, and also a 10% tariff on aluminum from Canada. Now, these are obviously very important metal products that are involved in the manufacture of lots of different things, but especially cars. And as you guys know, cars is a huge industry, not only in Canada, but also in the United States, also in Mexico, also in all sorts of countries around the world. So anything that rocks the boat on inputs or products that go into the development of these of cars is going to have a pretty profound impact on the overall economy. And when these tariffs were announced, there certainly was a lot of stress over how they would affect jobs in Canada. Now that it's technically more expensive to send goods across the border, does that mean that we're going to have to look for cheaper alternatives to labor to offset that cost? Well, again, it all depends on the case. And we're going to look at this case here and talk about how tariffs actually have an end effect on the consumer and on the businesses operating domestically. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a situation where a Canadian manufacturer sells $4,000 worth of steel and $2,500 in aluminum to a US manufacturer, and this will produce, let's say, one car. Now we're just looking at a single car situation. You can assume this is probably a manufacturing plant that buys hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in steel and aluminum from potentially, let's just say Stelco, just because it's a good example for a local area. And what we're going to do is calculate the total tariff applied to this transaction. So we're going to figure out how much the tariff is on the steel, how much the tariff is on the aluminum, and we're going to add these up. So there's a 25% tariff on steel. Now, as is always the case when you're working with percentages, is you want to change them into a decimal. So 25% turns into 0.25, which is much easier to work with. So to find the tariff here, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 0.25 and we're going to multiply it by the total amount of the transaction in steel, which is $4,000. And you're going to find that is a $1,000 tariff. For the aluminum, we're going to do the same thing, but as is always the case with tariffs, tariffs are applied individually by industry and also by country. So although the US might have a 25% tariff on steel from Canada and a 10% tariff on aluminum from Canada, those might not be the same tariffs that they would apply to another country that they trade with on a regular basis. It might be lower, it might be higher. Maybe the tariff on aluminum coming from Brazil is higher than it is the tariff on steel. It all depends on, of course, all sorts of crazy geopolitical factors. The more that you follow political news from around the world, the more that it's easy to understand the motivations behind some of the creation of these tariffs and who stands to gain from the increase or decrease of tariff amounts. Aluminum is going to be the same way, but this time we have 10%. So let's change that into 0.10. And then the tariff on this, now it's $2,500 in aluminum. And that's going to be a $250 tariff on the amount of aluminum. Now, the question asks what the total tariff is. So that's going to be our $1,000 from the steel plus $250 from aluminum, and it'll be a $1,250 total tariff. Now, if we look at this from an individual standpoint, if this was just a company making one car, what that means is that there is a floating cost of $1,250 that someone needs to pay. Legally, tariffs are supposed to be paid by the company that is moving the product across the border. So the tariff affects the Canadian manufacturer. And if Stelco is selling the steel to this American company, then it falls on Stelco to pay the tariff to the United States government for the right to move their product across the border. But this is where we kind of get into the more philosophical argument behind tariffs and their effect on the overall payment and the cost of the product to the end consumer. Who pays the tariff? Well, again, in this case, legally, it's Canada. Right? Tariff applies to the importing country. It's not the Canadian government, it's the company that's sending it across the border. It's like when you order something off of eBay and it gets stopped at the border and you have to pay duty on it. That happens sometimes. The problem is Canada has a couple options here. Now all of a sudden they have to pay $1,250 more to send their product across the border. So the Canadian manufacturer, Stelco, has some decisions to make. It can pay the $1,250 and reduce its profits and its revenues by that amount, or it can do what most companies do, which is jack the price up on the steel so that they can offset the increased cost of the tariff. So maybe instead of $4,000 for steel and $2,500 for the aluminum, Stelco goes to the company in the States and says, actually, it's going to be $5,000 now for the steel and $3,500 for the aluminum. If you don't want to buy it, that's fine. But that's our new price, because if we sell it overseas, you know that we are going to have to pay this tariff. So basically, if the Canadian company decides to increase its costs, then the cost falls on the importer, falls on the company in the States that's buying the steel so it can make this car. And what do you think that US manufacturer is going to do about the increase in the cost? Well, generally, when companies have an increase in the cost to produce their product, they're going to respond by increasing the price of that product. When they actually sell it to the consumer or the dealership or wherever it's going, even online, or I know a lot of car companies are doing that these days where you can buy your car on the internet and it gets shipped to you, and I'm assuming a small box, and you add water and it just grows into a normal size car. I'm not really 100% sure. Now, this brings us to a really important question, and one that there's a lot of debate over, is does a free trade agreement make sense? To answer this, I popped a couple charts up there from the lesson. Now, these are computer and electronic manufactured exports. I know this has nothing to do specifically with vehicles. I guess it kind of does, because there are computer parts inside new vehicles that are being created, which of course tariffs could be applied to. But if you look at those charts on there, you'll see that between Canada and the United States, we export about 11. We export about $11 billion worth of computer and electronic manufactured parts to the States. And I'll pop the other graph up there, and you'll see that we actually import about, oh, look at that, $11 billion worth of computer parts from the United States. So there's essentially $11 billion worth of stuff going across the border from Canada to the US, and there's the almost same amount coming in from the US to Canada. Canada and the United States do have fairly similar economies. Obviously, theirs is considerably larger than ours, but we produce a lot of the same things. We have access to about the same level of technology in our countries, and our economies are extremely intertwined with each other. Does it make sense for $11 billion worth of products to be tariffed going in and then $11 billion worth of products to be tariffed going out? That seems like a lot of extra administrative costs that doesn't really need to be there because we're trading about the same amount both ways. Now, let's take a look at the current trade surplus between the United States and Canada. I'll just pop it up there. So I posted an article up there in the links for you to check out, but essentially it says here that our trade deficit with the United States is decreasing. And if you look at the total numbers there from there, it's $1.1 billion trade gap in October, $1.2 billion in September, and that's on like $300+ billion worth of sales. So our trade surplus with the States, I would say, is pretty close to zero. Yeah, 1.2 billion does seem like a lot, but when you're trading 300 billion, 1.2 billion is 0.3% or less. So in theory, considering we have approximately the same amount of goods coming in as going out, a free trade agreement does make sense. And I would say a free trade agreement makes sense in any case where there's a small trade surplus or non-existent surplus. If two countries are trading approximately the same amount of goods going one way or the other, then it seems like a real pain in the butt, basically, to tariff both sides of that transaction. Why charge about the same amount of money going in as coming out when instead you can just charge nothing and everyone just cuts their losses and moves on? The savings comes in the administration of that. You don't need to pay people in government to track tariffs. You don't need to pay people in companies to track the total amount coming in from each individual manufacturer across the border from, let's say in this case, Canada and the United States. You can avoid those costs, and there's less accounting fees, and there's less tax considerations, and you probably have to hire less international tax lawyers and things like that. There's a lot of benefits of having free trade in reducing the amount of money we spend as a society on tracking the movement of things over the border. Anyways, that's the end of this week's lesson. If you have any questions, drop me an email. Of course, you have that video or you have that assignment there on Burma Castrol. If you have any questions about it, it's a pretty in-depth case study. If you've got any questions, drop me an email. I'd be glad to answer your questions. Hope you have a great week. We'll talk to you later.